Welcome to part 3 of this bike build series. We're going to be cutting off excess fork steer tubes. So we're going to learn how to measure and cut. So here we have our stem. This is the top of our stem here. And here is our excess fork steer tube. So in some cases, if this wasn't so tall, we could probably add a 5mm spacer and put our top cap on top of it. But since we have approximately ½ inch to 3/4 of an inch of excess, say I want to cut this off, I want this to be, I don't want to add a spacer on top here. I want this to be flush with my stem here. So all we have to do is put a cut mark here. We're gonna, for marking, you're gonna scrawl and scribe a marking here. And then we want to take the fork out, and then we're going to measure 3mm below that scribe mark. So when we put this fork back on, the fork will be, top of the steer tube will be 3mm below the top surface of this stem. That way we have room for that top cap to sit on and also room for adjustment. All right, before we begin, we want to make sure that our headset's installed correctly, everything's seated properly, there's no excess spacing in here. So fork is all the way up, bearings are seated correctly, top and bottom. And it's your choice whether you're putting spacers underneath your stem. You should have taken this for a test ride with spacers, making sure the height of your handlebars is where you need it. So at this point we have excess forked steer tube. So it's your choice. Either we can add a spacer here, bring it up a bit, put a spacer on top, and then throw a top cap on it. In this case, I want to get rid of this altogether. Now I do have a star nut in here because this is an older fork. So what I'm probably going to do is just pound that old star nut all the way into the rest of the steer tube. It's going to stay there. I'm not going to bother taking it out. It's not going to harm anything. It can stay there. We'll put a new star nut in when the time comes. So for measurement, we want this top of the steer tube to be about 3mm below the surface, which is right here of our stem. So we want this to be 3mm below. So in order to get that, we're gonna scribe a mark. Either you have a scratch awl or something hard that's gonna put a line in there. Do a very light scribe with this filing tool, or it's actually a saw blade, right at the base of the stem. Something I can go back to and see. Now I can see this, you may not see it on camera. Then what we're gonna do is take the stem off, we're gonna take the fork off the bike, and then we're gonna measure 3mm below that scribe mark. And then that's where I'm gonna cut. So when I put this fork back in, the top of this is going to, top of the steer tube is gonna be 3mm below the top edge of that stem, right where my fingernail is. That's where we want this to end up. All right, so for cutting purposes, I went and changed the fork. I'm not gonna cut my original fork, but I got this backup fork. So the scribe line, we're gonna say it's about right here. That's the scribe line that I had when the stem was still on there. So this mark right here, this little black mark, we're gonna measure 3mm below it, and then we're gonna make another line, and that's where we're gonna cut. So if you're good with your eyeballs, you can just kind of guesstimate 3mm, or you can get a ruler out, measure 3mm, as close as you can to 3mm. And remember your blade, your cutting blade that's gonna be cutting this is approximately 1mm. So you're gonna be taking about 1mm away with that saw. So I'm gonna measure, since 1, 2, 3, this is a pretty fat tipped marker, but I'm gonna put a little dot just below it. So that little dot right there, I'm gonna cut just below that dot right there. All right, so gonna be using the, this is an old one, but it's a Park Tool SG-6. The last number may have changed since this is probably 15 years old. So this is gonna allow me to make a really nice cut. It's got 2 pieces of metal right here. Blade's gonna fall right in the slit. It's gonna allow me to cut a nice straight line. This is going into the vise, so you do need a vise for this. This portion here is going in, and then there's a little plastic over on this side that won't facing me, so we're going to tighten this up. All right, so we're going off the mark that is 3mm below the original scribe, which is going to be right about where my nail is. So we're going to stick this in this end, and then you can look through the 2 pieces of metal, the slit here, and you want to find that mark and get it as close as you can from this point, and then we can go ahead and double check. So for that, I have another loose saw blade here. So you can get that saw blade, you can just stick it right between the 2 pieces of metal, the guide, and then you can look around the other side. You can see where it falls, and see if you hit your mark. And if you need to move it, just go ahead and move it, loosen this guy up, feed it through or extract it. And you want this to mark up perfectly. So that looks pretty good to me right there. We're ready for cutting. So we're gonna be using a metal type blade here, and usually these have arrows on it. This arrow is pointing forwards, which means the teeth are all going that direction instead of that direction. So that means all the cutting is going to be done as you're pushing forward. So you want to keep a nice straight line. And that's what this guide's going to help you do. So what I like to do is just start off real low, let the weight of the saw make the first cut. You're just going to let it roll through real easy just to start it, and then you can go ahead and pull back. When you pull back, you're using no weight pushing down. Going forward, you can use some force. That's where it's doing the cutting. So you can apply force going down and forward. When you're coming back, just let it guide the weight of the saw. Let that weight just guide back, push down forward, and then so on. That way it's going to help keep the life of your blade. So happy cutting. All right, so now when we go back, push our fork all the way up, make sure everything's seated properly. Get those bearings where they belong, top and bottom. Pushing up firmly from underneath, and then we're going to go ahead and install our stem. So this is what we're looking for right here. This is the top edge of our steer tube. This is the top edge of our stem, and you can see the gap here. So this silver portion is not flush or protruding up. It's down below approximately 3 millimeters. We definitely need that spacing. So when you go to apply your top cap on there, so some top caps have a little ledge or an inner drop in. So we need that to make sure that that piece doesn't come in contact with your steer tube. If your top cap comes in contact with the top of your steer tube, we're never going to get a good adjustment, because once we put this on top, this is going to take any loose play out of there. That's going to be your fine tunement right here. So this screw right here does not tighten up very tight. You're just doing this almost finger tight. We're not torquing it down. So this right inside here, that's our star nut right here. So we got a little flange there, space, flange, space. So it's almost looking like has little star ends on it. So that is seated to a certain depth. So there's a tool, I'll show you that. We're gonna drive that in because it stays in with pressure. It's like a barbed hook. It goes in one way and it stays stuck in there. You can't pull it out. So that star nut becomes one with the inside of the steer tube. So when we go to put our top cap on, this top cap is going to screw directly into that star nut. So when this starts to get tight, what's actually happening is it's starting to pull the whole fork upward as I'm tightening. So it's taking that little bit of play out. It's like tightening up your belt buckle. You got one more hole you need to tighten it up. You pull it and then poke it through that hole. That's what this is doing. So I'm doing this finger tight. And again, this is only like 2 to 3 Newton meters of tightness. We don't want to go too tight. It's just mainly for adjustment. So when I tighten this one up, I'm making contact with the bearings. Now I don't want to crush the bearings or put too much pressure on the bearings. All we want is to take the play out so everything's touching nice and soft, and then the bearings are still able to move. If we tighten this too much, one, we could possibly destroy our star nut, so it might break on you, or all we're going to do is also put too much pressure on the bearings. So when we go to turn our bars, the bearings are going to feel really tight because they're compressed too much. So it's basically like a bear hug. So we need to loosen up that bear hug a little bit, but find that perfect setting to where this handlebars move side to side like butter, but also that we don't have any excess play in there, moving around left and right or forwards and backwards.